So growing up, I enjoyed your typical childhood game of tag. I enjoyed playing hide and seek. But for some reason, growing up in the Hmong household, all my Hmong cousins and friends always enjoyed it more in the dark. Tag in the dark, hide and seek in the dark. We even played Monopoly in the dark. Just kidding on that last one. Not me. I hated playing these games in the dark. It wasn't because I was afraid of the dark. I wasn't afraid of it, but I just didn't like seeing where I was going. I've been a big kid all my life, and so as if it was hard enough trying to avoid getting tagged or hiding, to do it all in the dark felt like stacking up one more thing against my disadvantage. No, thank you. I just simply wanted to enjoy the game as it was. Now, unfortunately, this trend followed me into college. At one of the retreats I attended, of course, with Hmong students, we decided to play Capture the Flag in the dark. I was a little hesitant at first, but after a couple of rounds, it didn't seem too bad. I mean, after a while, your eyes are supposed to adjust in the dark, right? And so I was like, oh, maybe I haven't given this a fair chance. Maybe, it's fun. And so after a couple rounds, I'm like, all right, I get used to this. And so after a couple rounds, we started a new round. And about 20 to 30 minutes in the game, I found an opportunity to capture the opposing team's flag. No one was guarding it. It seemed to be the perfect opportunity. So I decided to make a dart for it. And out of nowhere, an unexpected force just blindsided me. My entire body got flung in a different direction, and as much as I tried to stop myself from going that direction, I involuntarily just fell on the ground, laying there with a huge throbbing pain in my head. It took me a couple minutes to realize what had happened. And all of a sudden, the flashlights come on, and I was like, come on, guys, we could have avoided this if we played in the light. Flashlights came on, and then I soon realized that an opposing defender had flanked me and collided with me head on. I probably had close to 100 pounds on the defender, plus momentum, but I got dropped like a sack of rice. And like after every fun game that you play, once someone gets hurt, you have to end it. And from that day on, I told myself, no more games in the dark. How is it any fun when you can't see what's going on? Now, as I mentioned earlier, I wasn't afraid of the dark, but I didn't like the feeling of not knowing where I was going or what was happening around me. It made no sense that we weren't using one of God's best creation, the gift of light, the very first thing that He created, to enjoy what we were doing. I mean, in all honesty, if I think about how I use light, apart from using my iPhone to check Facebook, to watch YouTube, I probably use it as a flashlight above all these things. Looking for things under my bed, or looking for things in the dark closet, or looking for things that are in the cracks of my seat. You see, light is a great tool, and it serves a great purpose in our lives. It also serves a great purpose for our spirituality. In the last few weeks here, and like I mentioned earlier at the beginning, we've been exploring Jesus' I am statements. Now, these I am statements are bold proclamations, and when Jesus uttered them, they were controversial proclamations that Jesus made about Himself to help us understand who He is. These statements are significant because they reveal something important, something key about Jesus' identity. And this morning, we're going to take a look at His second I am statement in John chapter 8, verse 12, which says, I am the light of the world. Now, even if you don't know anything about these statements, or if you don't know anything about Jesus, or you don't know anything about the series that we're on, you've got to admit, this is a pretty bold statement. If someone showed up and said, I am the light of the world, essentially at face value, if we interpret it literally, they are saying that they are the sun sitting in the middle of our solar system, providing light, heat, energy that is essential to all survival. That's a pretty bold claim, even if you don't understand what Jesus is saying, what the context is. But that's the thing. To better understand what Jesus is actually saying, we should understand the context. We should understand what's going on. And when we do, it makes a whole lot more sense. And so this morning, we're going to take a look at what's going on when Jesus says, I am the light of the world. So John chapter 8 and John chapter 7 tie in together. And in John chapter 7, we're told that the Jewish festival of tabernacles is approaching. It's coming up. And there's some information on what this festival is about. It's on the back of your bulletin. And you can read more about it in passages like Leviticus chapter 23, verse 33 to 34. But the Feast of Tabernacles, the Festival of Tabernacles, was a celebration held at the end of the harvest around late September to mid-October. And so after however long their season of gardening was, while they sowed and tended and weeded their gardens, the Feast of Tabernacles was a time for them to celebrate the end of the harvest after they had collected all of their crops. It was one of the three most important festivals in the Jewish calendar. It was so important that if people lived away from Jerusalem, away from the temple where they worshipped at, they would take a pilgrimage. They would come back to Jerusalem to celebrate it. It was again, something that they made time, set aside time for, to come back to celebrate. The festival lasted 8 days, and during the festival, participants would construct little tents made with branches to live in. Now, they did this because the festival focused on two primary things. There's a lot more, but these are two of the primary things that they celebrated. Again, one, it marked the end of the harvest, and so it was a time to be joyous. It was a time to be grateful. It was a time to thank God for providing them with a harvest. And offerings to God would be made so often that the entire group of priests would have some sort of responsibility to make sacrifices. After the Jewish people completed harvesting, again, the crops that they sowed and attended, again, they attended this this festival to honor God for the harvest. And the second, the festival commemorated the 40 years that their ancestors spent in the desert after being freed from Egypt. Earlier, I mentioned how participants would construct these little tents made of branches to remember God's providence when they wandered to the deserts. This reminded them that they had temporary shelter and that God provided food, water, protection from both from natural elements, while the ancestors were in the desert for 40 years. But again, these temporary tents that they built during the festival reminded them that God didn't intend them to be nomads, to travel from place to place and build temporary shelter from place to place to live in the desert, but rather God had a plan for them. This is what an author of an article says. Ken Burris describes that dwelling in the temporary structures incited thanksgiving for what God has done and bringing them into their permanent homes in the promised land. And so wandering the journey was part of the journey that eventually led them to the land that God promised them. Living in these temporary shelters was, again, just a moment as they anticipated God giving them a permanent land in the promised land for them to live in. But the Israelites, while they were wandering the desert for 40 years, they had no way to navigate themselves away from Egypt to the promised land. They didn't have GPS, they didn't have compasses, they didn't have maps. The only thing they had to rely on, the only thing that they could rely on was God. And just like how they depended on God for food, for water, for protection, they were dependent on God to guide them to the promised land. Earlier, right before this, John had read to us Exodus chapter 13. And in Exodus chapter 13, verse 20 to 22, it describes to us how God guided them while they were in the desert. During the day, God appeared as a pillar of cloud. And in the evening, at nighttime, God appeared and would lead them in a pillar of fire. Now, this was one of the visible symbols of God's presence with his people, and it was one of the things that was celebrated at the Festival of Tabernacles. The people try to capture the pillar of fire during the festival, and George Beasley Murray, a Bible scholar, describes how significant and extravagant this celebration was. This description that I'm going to read is a little bit lengthy. It's going to be on screen, and so feel free to sit back, feel free to listen. If you want to follow along, feel free to do so, but if you want to just listen and imagine what this festival looked like, I invite you to do so. So this is what the Festival of Tabernacles looks like based on George Beasley Murray's description. This is what he says. He who has not seen the joy of the place has not seen in his whole life. Let me say it again. He who has not seen the joy of the place has not seen joy in his whole lifetime. Golden lamps were there, and 4 golden bowls were on each of them, and 4 ladders were by each. Young men from the priestly group had jugs of oil in their hands containing about 120 logs and poured oil from them into the individual bowls. Wicks were made from the discarded trousers of the priest. There was no court in Jerusalem that was not bright from the light. Men danced with torches in their hands and sang songs and praises. The priests stood with zithers and harps and cymbals and trumpets and other musical instruments. The dancing and singing lasted all night till dawn, and it was the endeavor of the pious not to sleep any night of the feast. It evidently did not lack the element of entertainment. The nightly celebration ended with 2 appointed priests with trumpets slowly descending the steps of the court. They repeatedly call out, "We are Yahweh's, and our eyes are directed on Yahweh." This was quite the celebration. Again, this idea that it was a celebration, if someone didn't see it, they didn't experience the joy of a lifetime. That these golden lamps weren't just little bowls, but they were bowls where you needed a ladder to climb onto them. And so again, there was some height to these bowls. Young men took jugs of oil, all right? We're talking about jugs. We're talking about gallons of oil, right? The bowls, there was about 120 logs that they poured the oil on. 120 logs is a lot of logs. Think of like just us decimating like the back end of the building here and just taking logs. Again, we're not talking about wood, we're talking about logs, right? 120 logs, I don't know if it was 120 logs per cup. If that was the case, that'd be a crazy fire, but my guess is it might have been 30 per bowl. But again, 20 logs, and they would take discarded trousers. They would take the old underwear of the priest, and those were wicks. All right. So again, just imagine how big this lamp had to be. Again, it was a party all night long with music. Again, did not lack element of entertainment. And so for me, the image that I got, I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan, and so the image I got was in part 3, if you're a Lord of the Rings person, Return of the King, when they light the beacons. And so I believe it says that, it's believed that there were about 20 logs per beacon. And so when they lit the beacons, you could see them and they would light them to signal that Gondor needed help. A close second that came to me was just the fire emoji. Lots and lots of fire emoji. But here's an illustration from Bible scholars that resemble what the festival might have looked like. And so if you take a look, there's the temple. And so there were the 4 bowls. And again, you see how they're elevated. So the priests needed to climb those. And again, it was lit and it shined so bright that, again, all the courts in the temple were lit up. So this was a sight to see. For the Jews who celebrated the Festival of Tabernacles, they were trying to capture what their ancestors experienced. They wanted to capture the sensation of the pillar of fire that was guiding them through the night as they remembered how God provided for them while they were in the desert. For Jesus, this festival was the best image to show the people what they were going to experience from him as they celebrated what they had experienced from God and what God showed them. Jesus was finding ways to connect himself to the Old Testament. And so, of course, he was connecting himself to Exodus chapter 12. He was connecting him to Old Testament prophecies like Isaiah chapter 9, verse 2, which says this: The people are walking in darkness. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the deep darkness, a light has dawned. To him, Jesus was really revealing to them how he was going to fulfill that prophecy, how he was going to be that great light. Again, the Festival of Tabernacles was the best image to draw a parallel between what God did in the Old Testament of sustaining life for the Israelites in the desert, and what Jesus was going to do to sustain eternal life for the people here after death. It was the best place to draw a parallel between what God did in the Old Testament of guiding the Israelites from slavery to freedom and what Jesus was going to do in guiding all of humanity from sin to holiness. You see, the Feast of Tabernacles was the perfect place for Jesus to declare the second I am statement. And this is the fullness of it in John chapter 8, verse 12, the fullness of the I am statement. I am the light of the world, that whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but have the light of life. Jesus' I am statement here, that I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but have the light of life. It showed that Jesus was God in the present, that Jesus was dwelling with his people as he did when they were in the desert. And just as he dwelled with the Israelites in the desert so that he could guide them to the promised land, he was dwelling with his people right now, guiding them from darkness to light, from sin to holiness, from death to life. That is the significance of this statement. And it leads me to wonder a few things about myself and hopefully you as well too. Do you have a destination in life? Not so much a physical destination, like a physical location you want to live, but where do you want to go in life? At the end of your life, what would be considered a good life? Where do you want to ultimately end up? In knowing that our faith gives us the promise that we can experience eternal life, is that where you end up? And if so, who is taking you there? Or maybe an honest question, even for myself, is what is taking us there? These questions remind me of a trip that Peng and I took a few years ago. And so we took a road trip to Ohio. And on our way there and back, we took a route that depended on how many Marshalls or TJ Maxx we could hit. It's a store that we both enjoy shopping at. And so we tried to find the most stores on the way and the most stores on the way back. Now, of course, it took us a lot longer to get to Ohio and to get back from Ohio to Minnesota because we let other things determine where we were going. But eventually we made it back because we still had the final destination in mind. For some of us, we might have that destination in mind, but the route or the guide or the person or the thing that we're following are leading us somewhere completely different. This morning, I think it might be worth us thinking over these two questions. Where do you ultimately want to end up? And who or what is taking you there? Take a moment to just think about that. Where do you ultimately want to end up? And who or what is taking you there? The reality is this: God blesses us with great things. God blesses us with beautiful things. He's created so many things that are awesome. But sometimes those great things distract us from what's more important. That the creation we get to experience has a creator who we can experience. And so let us be reminded that wherever we want to go, and my hope is that our final destination is with God, that the thing guiding us, or more importantly, the person that guiding us, will lead us there. Because we're given a promise here that Jesus is the light of the world, and that he's made a way for us to follow him so that we could be with God. So my hope for you, my hope for me, is that we could follow Jesus as he guides us there. Let me pray for us.